Freeborn John by Pauline Gregg, book review. Subtitle, A Biography of John Lilburne. So a little bit of background before I get into the meat of this review. This is a biography of John Lilburne, otherwise known as Freeborn John. John Lilburne was one of the leaders of the Leveller movement. Now the Leveller movement is a group or movement that took place in England in the 1640s during the English Civil War. There was a lot of upheaval at that time. Parliament was fighting the king, but among the soldiers there arose a movement for social and political equality for everybody. So no kings, no nobles, no grandees as they were called, just everybody had an equal vote, everybody had equal rights, completely getting rid of the old privileged system, considered quite radical for its day. Now, I had never heard about this in all my history education. I've been a history major at college, a history nerd all my life. I think this is one of those historical details which really doesn't get talked about enough. Possibly because this is a popular movement about the people rising up against oppression, which doesn't usually fit into the narrative. I had a professor at college who was strongly of the view that up until the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the idea of social and political equality did not exist. Now granted, this is kind of during the age of the Enlightenment, or I guess shortly thereafter, but still about 150 years before the French Revolution, and in England no less, which is not usually, people don't think of it as having a strong revolutionary tradition. So I found this fascinating. I was living in Japan at the time I first heard about it, and by the way, I first heard about this when reading a book called A People's History of the World by Chris Harman. This is one of the movements he covers in that book. I've reviewed that book on this channel. I've given it a rather negative review on the whole, but there were elements of it I found very interesting, and this was one of them. After reading the book, I was able to track down online a BBC miniseries about the Leveller movement, a four-part drama series called The Devil's Whore, which I've also reviewed on this channel, and which I've also given a mixed or somewhat negative review. It's a little bit overly melodramatic in places. But the film does dramatize the Leveller movement, and it does give a very intriguing and charismatic portrayal of John Lilburne, one of the leaders of the movement. So I'd recommend it on that basis, if nothing else. And for more information, check out my full review of The Devil's Whore. Anyways, I was in Japan and not able to track down a lot of books, but then when I came to Australia and I was studying at the University of Melbourne, I wandered into their English history section, and they actually had a very decent section on the Leveller movement. They had 4 rows on the shelf of books about the Levellers, which I think maybe just indicates maybe the gap between the type of books you find if you go into a bookstore or if you search on Amazon, and the type of books you have access to if you're in a university library. There apparently is a fair amount about the Levellers written in the university libraries, but you may have trouble finding these books in your local bookstore or on Amazon. That being said, you could probably order this book on Amazon. Freeborn John by Pauline Gregg. Anyways, once I discovered the Leveller section on the university library, and just having decided that this was something I was interested in reading about, I actually flipped through several of these books. There are biographies about other famous Levellers there. I picked up one on Thomas Rainsborough, which was interesting, but it was written in somewhat of a dry academic style, and I was reading this as a hobby. I wasn't studying history at the university. I was there to study linguistics. History was just my hobby. So I was looking for something not so academic, more readable, and in my opinion, just based on a quick survey of the books, flipping through them, this was the most readable of the bunch. This was written as a modern, accessible biography, not as an academic treatise. So once I read through a few pages of it and discovered that this was highly readable, I checked it out from the library and read it, and then here is my review. So, for the amateur historian, this is a good armchair history. It's not the best book I've ever come across. Parts of it are a bit dry, but for the most part, it's a very smooth read, and like any good armchair history book, it reads like a story. Now, while reading this book, I was a bit surprised about exactly how much biographical information we actually have about John Lilburne's life. I mean, whenever you pick up a biography of Shakespeare, that always says, we know nothing about Shakespeare's life, you know. And John Lilburne was actually not that far after Shakespeare. It was just a few decades after Shakespeare. So I just assumed that for this period we had very little biographical information on anybody who wasn't a king. But there actually is a lot of information here that author Pauline Gregg pulls into a biography. Some of this may be because Lilburne wrote so much about himself. He appears to have been a shameless self-promoter. But whatever the reason, the author is able to reconstruct a fairly detailed account of his life. For most of it, there are some gaps, particularly at the beginning of his life, when the author is reduced to speculation. And so there's so many sentences like, "It's easy to imagine that John Lilburne might also have been with the crowds on that day." So nobody knows, but there was this big demonstration, and it's easy to imagine John Lilburne must have been there as well. The first 100 pages especially are filled with this type of speculation. We're told about what John Lilburne probably did, what he almost certainly did, and what he could not have failed to do. So basically, anytime there's a big popular demonstration, the author just speculates that John Lilburne must have been part of it. Also, during the first 100 pages, the author will fill in some gaps in the narrative by writing about the intellectual climate at the time, or even resorting to some long, boring descriptions about what London was like during this period. Another problem with this narrative, and this isn't really the author's fault, it's just a problem with the narrative, is the somewhat repetitive nature of John Lilburne's tale. So much of this book is simply recounting the cat and mouse game between the leveller's printing press and the authorities who are trying to destroy it. So the levelers will publish an illegal pamphlet, the authorities will try and suppress it and find out who is responsible, then the levelers will go into hiding, and then they'll come out and they'll publish another pamphlet, and then the authorities will try and find them again. And this cycle just repeats itself several times throughout the book. It's interesting to a point, but by the end of the book you're wondering if some of this may have been summarized, or maybe we don't need to know about the life cycle of every illegal pamphlet the levelers published. Nonetheless, the cumulative effect of reading all this is to make you very appreciative of the freedom of the press and how important it is to live in a country where freedom of the press is guaranteed. Another problem with the narrative, and again this is not the author's fault, but John Lilburne was a martyr, meaning he spent most of his life locked away in jail. And it's hard to write an interesting biography of somebody who spends most of their life in jail. The author, I think, does the best she can under the circumstances. She writes about some of the pamphlets that Lilburne smuggled out of jail. She writes about some of the various friends and enemies he made while he was in jail. She also writes about his ability to influence events when he was in jail. But often, given the turmoil of this period, What is actually happening in the real world outside of the jail is much more interesting than the story of John Lilburne being stuck in the middle of the jail. So the author will often jump back and forth between the story of John Lilburne in jail and the story of the greater leveler movement happening outside. However, all that being said, there are plenty of parts of this book which are absolutely fascinating. The book is filled with plenty of scenes of courtroom drama, and because every time Lilburne was up in court, he wrote long pamphlets about his experiences, it turns out that the court drama is usually documented, and what I was somewhat surprised by the detail. So the author has plenty of details here to draw on for recreating all the drama of the John Lilburne in court. Another thing which I thought was very interesting is the changing relationship between Oliver Cromwell and John Lilburne, which is well documented in this book. So when Oliver Cromwell was simply an ordinary member of Parliament, Cromwell actually started out as a huge admirer of John Lilburne and was instrumental in freeing John Lilburne from his imprisonment. But as Cromwell becomes more powerful, then Lilburne and the Levelers become more of a thorn in his side, and then Cromwell becomes obsessed with suppressing John Lilburne and the Levelers. However, as this book shows, Lilburne and Cromwell always maintained some affection for each other, even as enemies. And when Cromwell was able to perceive that John Lilburne was no longer a political threat to him, he was even capable of acts of kindness towards Lilburne and his wife, and Lilburne in return wrote Cromwell letters gushing with thankfulness. Throughout the book, John Lilburne comes across as somebody who is remarkably dedicated to his cause, and can also be remarkably stubborn in pursuit of his ideals, refusing to be bought out and refusing to compromise. However, the author does not gloss over his faults either. She shows him as occasionally egotistical and a self-promoter. Also, although Lilburne made his name standing up for the poor and dispossessed, there is one unfortunate incident in which he appears to have acted harshly as a landlord towards his tenants. And the author Pauline Gregg dutifully records this, even though it reflects negatively on John Lilburne. And although author Pauline Gregg is largely sympathetic to the aims of the Leveler movement, the author points out some of their ideological shortcomings and inconsistencies. For example, the program which the Levelers introduced and petitioned the government for, the program which the Levelers introduced and petitioned the government for on behalf of this program is really hard to classify in terms of ideology. The Levelers wanted more government interference in cases where the poor would benefit from government involvement, and wanted less interference in cases where the poor would not benefit. The Levelers appealed to the ancient Anglo-Saxon law in cases where it supported their cause, and they appealed to the will of the people in other cases where the ancient Anglo-Saxon law would not have supported their cause. Basically, it looks like the Levelers' platform was designed to help the poorest members of society, but that was the only consistent thing about it. The ideological justification by which they got there tends to have shifted a lot. Although, to be fair, I don't think this is unique to the Levelers movement. You could make the same critique of the Democratic or Republican parties. It's very hard to tell if the Republicans actually want more government interference or less government interference. Same with the Democrats. I think you could make the argument that most political parties just have a platform which benefits its members, and then the ideology is lifted on backwards onto it afterwards. That seems to have been the case with the Leveler movement. They wanted to help the poor people, but somewhat of a confused ideology as to what exactly their philosophy was. However, the Levelers were not socialists. some people get confused about this. I've had experiences myself where I've been talking history with people who have been confused about this point. They weren't socialists, and Pauline Gregg emphasized this very clearly in this book. The Levelers always held that private property was a sacred right. So they were emphasizing political equality, which was quite radical for their time, but they did not want economic equality. They wanted some element of it, but they didn't want to abolish private property. There was another group at the time, though, who were arguably early communists, and these were the Diggers, who were actually early agrarian communists. The author Pauline Gregg wonders whether the Levelers would have had more success if they had managed to form an alliance with the Diggers. They never did manage to form that alliance, but quite possibly if they had, they would have had more success or more emphasis. It's something that Pauline Gregg floats the idea of. Reading about John Lilburne and the Leveler movement, there are a number of thoughts which occurred to me, and I'll just kind of go over those in no particular order. Number one is the issue of religion. So it's interesting reading this book how Christianity was used by all sides on the English Civil War. Both those fighting for the repressive government and those fighting for the people's rights. Both of them clearly believed that they had God on their side. Now, I suspect this was partly because in this pre-modern era, people couldn't conceive of a world without religion. And so religious terminology was all they knew. I suspect that a lot of these movements, if they existed today, would use more secular language if the same battles were being refought. Still, there's no denying that John Lilburne and the other Leveler leaders were deeply religious. But then so were the Royalists and the parliamentary grandees that they were fighting against. The second thought, it's notable that the success of the Leveler movement was because it was so attractive to the soldiers in the army. And in fact, if you think about it, most successful revolutionary movements have had a deep hold in the army. The French Revolution, Paris in 1848, Paris Commune, at least among the National Guard, Russia in 1917, Germany in 1919, etc. These were all revolutionary movements that were successful because they were able to appeal to the army. It's interesting to compare this maybe to the left in America nowadays, where the left is so detached from the army, or at least that's my impression. So you have this increasingly isolating rhetoric on the left that's popular in maybe college campuses or something like that, whereas the army in America nowadays tends to be very right-leaning. And that could well end up being a tactical mistake. Although I understand the dilemma. The dilemma goes back to the Vietnam War days, if not before, where the left identified the American army as kind of a repressive agent of American imperialism. But if there was some sort of balancing act that could be maintained, where you were not opposed to the American foreign wars, but you were supportive of the soldiers' rights in the soldiers, and there wasn't this huge gap between the left and the people in the army, maybe that would be the way forward. I don't know. But the other thing that struck me about reading this book was, despite having so much support from the rank and file of the army, as well as not only the army, but the citizens in London, the Leveler movement was ultimately defeated. And as I was reading this book, I was constantly wondering how they allowed themselves to be defeated so easily, despite having so much support. But as the author Pauline Gregg tells it, in the end, most of the soldiers proved reluctant to mutiny against their established leaders, even though they had the numbers. They were just very reluctant to mutiny when it came to it. And this is probably another theme that is all too common throughout history. People are so used to submitting to authority figures that movements don't often realize how powerful they actually are. One last note, this book was published in 1961. The edition I got out of the university library was published in 1961, and I'm not sure if it's been updated or not since then. But it's interesting because I believe that in Britain in the late 60s and early 70s, with the New Left going on and all that, there was a great resurgence in interest in the Leveler movement. And figures like Freeborn John. And that may have been interesting to include in the section on the Leveler's legacy at the end of the book. But obviously it couldn't have been included because this book was only written in 1961. So a more recent book on the Levelers may have some more sections on their legacy in the late 60s and 70s and how they again became popular during that time. Okay, I'll close out the review here.